What is the most eerie thing that's ever happened to you? Male, story 1. I woke up staring straight at the ceiling, my limbs frozen stiff like they were anchored to the bed. The room sat in a heavy silence, broken only by the faint hum of the fridge down the hall. My bed, shoved into the corner of my room, had always been a little haven. But that night, it felt like a trap. Across from me, the closet stood open, packed tight with random junk my family stuffed in there over the years. It was a mess of forgotten toys, old coats, and whatever crap no one knew where else to put. Something flickered in the corner of my eye. My gaze snapped to the closet, and that's when I saw it. A hand, delicate and pale, slid out from behind the clutter, fingers curling around the door frame. It was almost too smooth, like watching a spider's leg unfurl. The hand was followed by an arm, then a figure stepped out. A woman, draped in layers of white fabric that looked like it came straight from some dusty attic trunk. Victorian, I guess, though I never was into that old-timey stuff. She was tall, too tall, and she just stood there, framed in the doorway, her lips moving soundlessly. I couldn't hear a damn thing she was saying, but the way her mouth kept flapping, it was like she was arguing with a ghost only she could see. Her face had this almost pretty look, like a half-finished painting that someone abandoned because they messed up the eyes or something. It threw me off, that almost pretty face that kept twitching and shifting as she murmured. Then, without warning, she went still. Those strange eyes locked onto mine. I couldn't look away, even if I wanted to. She smiled, but it wasn't a smile. Her mouth kept stretching and stretching until it seemed like it would tear her skin. I swear, the corners of her lips reached back to her ears. She took a step toward me, her shoes scraping against the floor, a sound that sent chills crawling down my spine. She leaned closer, and that's when her jaw dropped, unhinging like a snake. The gaping hole of her mouth yawned wider and wider, dark and endless. A foul, decaying stench hit me, like something that's been dead and rotting for weeks. Her breath filled the room as she crawled onto the bed, knees sinking into the mattress. That awful guttural moan started like a chorus of voices, all out of sync, vibrating through the air. My chest caved under her weight, lungs burning for air. I could feel her wet, cold mouth sliding over my forehead. The darkness swallowed me as she engulfed my entire face. Then, just like that, I jerked awake, gasping, sheets drenched in sweat. The room was empty, the closet as cluttered as ever, but the stench of rot lingered. It clung to the air, a reminder that whatever I saw, whether real or a trick of my brain, left its mark. Male story 2. The call came in like any other. Some guy complaining about chest pain, nothing special. Middle of nowhere, off one of those long, empty roads where houses are more like shacks and barns blend into the trees. I've done this job long enough that places like this don't faze me anymore. They all smell like motor oil, wet hay, and regret. We pull up to this old barn/garage. It had that look, peeling paint, a sagging roofline, like it was about to keel over. Nothing screamed out of the ordinary, but the second I stepped off the truck, something gnawed at my gut. I've been on enough scenes to know when something's off, even if I can't put a finger on it. While the other guys prepped the gear, I decided to take a quick lap around the building. Just a habit, really. Not every barn out here is as straightforward as it looks. As I rounded the corner, the air grew thicker. The ground was all mud and crushed leaves, and the whole place had this silence, like even the birds had flown off. I reached a grimy window on the side. The grass yellowed with grime. I had to lean in close, peering through the muck. That's when I saw it. There, rigged to the door, was a shotgun, angled just right. If I'd pushed through that front door like usual, I'd have been shredded. The whole setup was janky but effective. Ropes, nails, and a few boards holding the thing in place. Whoever set this up knew exactly what he was doing. And that's when I saw him, hanging in the corner, swaying, like some kind of macabre pendulum. I yelled back to the team, waving them off the front. We smashed through some flimsy plexiglass on the side, not wanting to risk the door trap. The smell hit us first. That sickly sweet stench that says it's already too late. His body hung there, a shadow with slack limbs, eyes lost in whatever darkness had swallowed him. The shotgun trap was still armed, ready to blow the first person to open that door, straight to hell. Nothing we could do for him. He was already gone, cold to the touch. The rigging on the shotgun was amateur, but deadly enough. It's crazy how one split-second decision, like walking around the side instead of going straight in, can be the difference between life and a load of buckshot to the chest. We radioed it in, waited for the sheriff to show up, and just stood around in the cold, letting the wind bite at our faces. Another call, another mess we couldn't fix. Mayo Story 3. I was knee-deep in paperwork, as usual. Being the manager of a computer repair section in a big-box retailer wasn't exactly glamorous, but it kept me busy. That morning, I was tucked away in the back office, surrounded by the hum of machines and the stale scent of coffee grounds. We had a customer's desktop hooked up, running the usual malware scans. The screensaver had kicked in, cycling through snapshots from the owner's My Pictures folder. At first, it was all the typical stuff. Birthday parties, kids with frosting-smeared faces, a couple of vacation shots. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my heart skip. Just for a split second. It was a photo of a woman, her throat slashed, a mess of crimson spilling down her shirt. I blinked hard and turned to look straight at it, but by the time my eyes focused, it was gone. The screensaver was back to images of shiny cars lined up at some show. Maybe I'd been staring at the screen too long. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I brushed it off and went back to my stack of invoices. Hours passed, a blur of calls, paperwork, and routine checkups. But it gnawed at me. I kept catching myself glancing at that screen, like it had a secret it was hiding. Then, while hauling another customer's laptop to the repair station, my peripheral vision betrayed me again. This time, I could have sworn I saw the image of a bloodied body crammed in the trunk of a car. I froze, hands trembling slightly as I set the laptop down. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed one of the techs, James, and pulled him to the back. We both stood there, eyes glued to the damn screensaver, waiting. I could feel my pulse in my neck. It took about 10 minutes, but there it was again. 2 corpses, half buried in a shallow grave, surrounded by dry, cracked earth. The next slide was even worse, a severed hand resting like a grotesque keepsake in a kitchen drawer. I could see James's face go pale as he muttered something under his breath. I didn't waste any time. I went straight to the general manager, told him everything, and after a brief, grim silence, we made the call. We better let the cops handle this. Whatever was on that computer, it wasn't our problem anymore. 15 minutes later, just as the tension was settling into my bones, 2 men walked into the store. One was the owner of the computer, a stocky guy in his 40s. The other one, I assumed, was a friend or coworker. I told him we were still working on it, trying to buy some time, but he cut me off, saying he'd been called down because of some disturbing photos we'd found. My heart sank. How did he know? I brought him back to his computer. The guy looked at the screen, and then his buddy started laughing, a full, deep-bellied laugh that filled the cramped space. Turns out he was a detective who'd been a little too cavalier with his work files. Those photos, crime scene evidence he'd apparently swiped from the station to finish up reports at home. The idiot never realized his computer had turned those images into a screensaver. I stood there, still gripping the counter with white knuckles. The guy just shrugged, muttering about how he'd have to change the screensaver settings. And that was that. He packed up his machine and left, leaving me and James standing there in the quiet hum of the repair room, the air thick with a sour blend of relief and disbelief. Female story 4. Tajikistan hit me like a punch to the senses. The dry air stung my nose as I stepped off the plane, my new colleagues waving from the gate like I was some long-lost friend. They were all smiles, welcoming me in a flurry of handshakes and half-broken English. From the airport, we crammed into an old van that rattled down dusty roads lined with squat sun-bleached buildings, everything tinted a shade of beige under the late afternoon sun. When we pulled up to the apartment complex, my first impression wasn't exactly great. The whole place looked like a relic of the Soviet era. Dull concrete, cracked walls, and those bleak metal staircases that clanged underfoot as we climbed. But stepping into the actual apartment, it was like falling through a trapdoor into another world. Ornate rugs spread like tapestries across every inch of the floor. Dark webbing filled the hallways and cavernous leather sofas, walls covered in lush, jewel-toned wallpaper that seemed to glimmer in the low light, chandeliers that looked heavy enough to cave in the ceiling. It was a kind of strange, hidden luxury that made me feel like I'd stumbled into some forgotten aristocrat's lair. I got settled, the women fussing over me, bringing endless plates of sweets and fruit, insisting I eat until I could hardly move. Dinner that night was a whirlwind of laughter and rich, heavy food. My male colleagues surrounded me on plush floor pillows, around a table just inches off the ground. The room was a swirl of voices, clinking glasses, and those big, warm smiles that made everything feel oddly intimate, like I'd known these people for years. Later, when the day's buzz died down, I retreated to my room. The woman who'd been taking care of me slipped in one last time with towels, her eyes dark and serious as she told me to lock the door. I didn't need convincing. Those metal doors looked like they could stop a battering ram. I settled in, called my husband, and talked until my voice turned to a sleepy murmur. The apartment went dead quiet after that. I must have drifted off with the phone still in my hand, but something pulled me awake hours later. A sound, soft and haunting, like a melody carried on the wind. Someone was singing, the notes low and trembling. It seeped through the thick walls, muffled but steady. I pushed myself out of bed, the cold tile biting my feet. I crept to the window, pressing my forehead against the glass, squinting into the darkness. The mountains loomed in the distance, black against a faint silver glow. The song drifted from that direction, rising and falling like a tide. I couldn't understand the words, but there was something in it. Grief, maybe, or longing, that sank into my bones. I stayed there, frozen, until the singing stopped. The room felt even colder when it finally went silent. At breakfast, I brought it up, hoping someone would laugh it off or tell me it was just a late-night celebration in the village. Instead, they exchanged glances, the kind that said more than words ever could. Then one of them shrugged, said something vague about old traditions, ancient things that lived in the mountains. And that was it. I pushed for more, but they just went back to their plates, the conversation flowing on as if I'd never said a word. The female story 5. The house was practically swallowed by darkness every night, the Nevada sky swallowing any hint of light. I'd always hated how quiet it was, especially with my ex away on his night shifts. The place felt like it existed in its own forgotten pocket of the world, a lone speck surrounded by fields that stretched into shadows with no neighbor in sight for miles. That night, I had crashed early, trying to drown the silence with exhaustion. I slipped into one of those heavy, deep sleeps where your dreams wrap around you, dense and inescapable. It started with him, my ex, standing near a cliff that seemed to just drop into an endless abyss. It wasn't quite the Grand Canyon, but it had that same jagged vastness. He stood there like a statue, rigid and unresponsive. I called out to him, waving my arms, shouting his name, but he didn't even flinch, just kept his gaze pinned to whatever invisible thing was out there, somewhere beyond the cliff's edge. And then, like someone had flipped a switch, he spun around and lunged for me. His fingers dug into my arms, his eyes wild, like a trapped animal that had just spotted its escape. His words came out in a harsh whisper, teeth clenched. Name. There's somebody in the house. I jerked awake, gasping like I'd been yanked up from underwater. For a second, I couldn't remember where I was. The silence of the room pressed in, thick and heavy. My heart was hammering so hard I swore it would shake the bed. I kept still, straining my ears for the slightest rustle, the faintest creak. The house was still, too still. Just as I started convincing myself it was just the aftershocks of a nightmare, the dog bolted up from his spot at the foot of the bed. He was off like a shot, barking with this deep, guttural ferocity I'd never heard from him. The dog door flapped wildly as he tore through it, straight into the yard. The barking grew distant, echoing into the black void outside. I didn't move. My skin was prickling, my whole body rigid. The sound of the wind whistling through the gaps in the windows, the occasional groan of the old wooden house settling, it all seemed amplified. I kept waiting for some noise to break through, something that would tell me what the dog had sensed. But there was nothing. Just the damned darkness pressing against the windows like a living thing. Eventually, the barking stopped. I heard the soft patter of paws on the porch, the dog door creaking as he came back in. He looked at me like nothing had happened, trotted back to his spot, and curled up. Just like that, as if he hadn't just gone on some mad dash into the night. But I stayed wide awake, eyes darting around the room, waiting for the first hint of dawn to creep through the blinds. Something had shifted that night, even if I couldn't say exactly what it was. The house felt different, like it was holding its breath, watching. Male Story 6. I remember that night clear as day. I was just heading home after a late shift, tired but looking forward to sinking into the couch with a cold drink. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a typical Tuesday, really. But as I made that last left onto my street, something gnawed at me. It wasn't just a flicker of worry or paranoia. No, it was like my gut was clenching around this weird certainty that something was off. I tried brushing it off, even muttering under my breath, "Please let my house be fine." You know, almost like saying it out loud would break whatever weird spell had me on edge. But as soon as I turned the corner, I noticed it. The blinds in my bedroom window were a mess. Not just crooked from the wind or anything, but twisted and shoved around, like someone had tried to force their way through. My heart lurched, and that strange feeling from before hit me full force. I pulled into my driveway, engine barely off before I jumped out. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, trying to get the front door open. Walking into my place, I knew right away someone had been there. The air felt wrong, stale and heavy, like it had been holding its breath. My living room looked fine, but stepping into my bedroom was another story. Drawers open, clothes tossed around, and things I hadn't seen in years scattered across the floor. What really got to me was what was missing. Not the laptop or the watch on my dresser, but weird, personal things. Old letters I had shoved in a box, a few shirts that were tucked in the back of the closet. It felt like someone had been digging through my life, looking for I don't know what. I tried piecing it together, pacing the room, picking up my scattered belongings. That's when the neighbor came over. I'd seen him around before, always smoking on his porch, a shadow in the corner of my eye. Turns out he'd noticed the guy earlier that evening. So had a few other neighbors, but none of them did anything. They'd all seen him shimmy through my bedroom window. Some lanky dude, always lurking around, eyes too wide and curious, too fixated on me. But they were all too scared to get involved. What really left me cold, though, was when I learned what the creep took. It wasn't money or gadgets, just odd, personal items. A framed photo of me and my sister, a couple of cheap trinkets, like he was building some kind of shrine. The whole thing sent a chill through me. And that feeling, that gut instinct before I even pulled up to the house, it stayed with me long after the cops came and went, long after I replaced the blinds and double-checked all the locks. It was like I had this sixth sense about it, this unexplainable signal warning me before I even saw the evidence. After that night, every creak of the floorboards and rustle outside made my skin prickle. May Story 7. The day after Dad passed, the house felt hollow. Calls kept coming in, visitors shuffling through with their sad eyes and clumsy hugs. I'd reached my limit, so I retreated to my room, shut the door, and let exhaustion take over. I collapsed onto the bed, hoping to drift into something, anything, that wasn't reality. When sleep hit, it hit hard, but it wasn't the blank, dreamless kind I needed. Instead, I found myself back in that sterile hospital room, the one that still smelled of antiseptic and faded hope. Dad was there, lying in the same bed surrounded by doctors who were busying themselves with tubes and monitors. His skin had that pale, waxy look that I had tried so hard to forget. I pushed through the crowd, heart pounding. I shouted at them to stop, to just let him be, but they weren't attaching anything. They were taking the wires and IVs out of him, unhooking him like he was some appliance being shut down. He sat up, slow but steady, the way he never could in those last weeks, and he was wearing this white robe like some kind of old-fashioned nightgown. It looked so out of place on him, a man who lived in faded flannel shirts and worn-out jeans. We walked out of that cold, lifeless room into somewhere completely different. The hospital walls disappeared, replaced by a landscape that seemed to glow from the inside. A clear stream wound its way through tall, swaying grass. I could hear the faint rush of water, the kind that always made Dad relax whenever he went fishing. He looked healthier, younger almost. The deep lines etched into his face had softened. As we walked, I started babbling about random things, anything to fill the silence. I told him about the Avengers movie we'd seen together, how he'd cracked up at the Hulk's rage-fueled tantrum. I even tried imitating the way he'd burst out laughing in the theater, that deep belly laugh that always made people turn around and stare. I threw in that bit about how he'd have died laughing at one part. Dad gave me a crooked smile and raised an eyebrow at my choice of words. I apologized, but he just chuckled. But then, without any warning, his smile disappeared. He stopped walking and turned to face me. His eyes, those familiar, tired eyes, locked onto mine. He said it bluntly, almost like it slipped out. He hadn't wanted to die. I jolted awake, breath catching in my throat like I'd been underwater too long. My pillow was soaked and I could still hear the rush of that stream in my ears. I sat up, blinking away the dream, but even as the fog of sleep cleared, the echo of Dad's words stayed. Mail Story 8. The night shift in the ER had its usual chaos, the kind that hums through your bones and keeps your nerves on a hair trigger. Patients would roll in, either groaning in pain or stone silent, eyes flickering under the fluorescent lights. That night, though, we had a real handful. The guy came in reeking of whiskey and sweat, fists clenched, teeth grinding. We'd seen the type before. He wasn't here to be helped. He was here to make everyone's life hell. The instant we tried to approach him, he turned feral. Nurses dodged his wild swings as he cursed like he was casting a spell. I was one of the techs that got the lovely job of restraining him. The second I got close, he spat right in my face. Hot, wet, and reeking of alcohol. I could almost taste it. That was bad enough, but then came the threats. He promised, loud enough for everyone to hear, that he'd find my family and finish the job if I ever dared cross him again. Just a mess of slurred threats and wild eyes. Eventually, we got him strapped down. The doc pumped him full of sedatives, and he finally shut up. I pressed charges, of course. The guy was a menace. But the legal system dragged on, and his case kept getting pushed back. A continuance here, another there. 8 months passed. I barely thought about it anymore. Just another ugly blip in a string of forgettable nights. One morning, groggy from another graveyard shift, I found myself slumped in a corner seat on the train, staring blankly at my phone, scrolling through the nothingness of social media. I was minding my business, dead to the world, when I heard this voice behind me. Low, but clear. Thank you for saving my life. I turned confused, and there he was, the same guy, but he looked different now, like someone had taken a hose and blasted the grime off him. He wasn't swaying or glaring. He stood there steady, almost unrecognizable. He went on and on, spilling apologies like they were pouring out of him. He said he was sober now, 8 months clean. He fumbled with his pocket, pulling out this ratty old Sudoku book, tore a page out and scribbled something. A free meal coupon for some restaurant I'd never heard of. It wasn't like some Hallmark moment where everything suddenly made sense. It was just tropery, and surreal even. I could still remember that hot spit on my face, the way his eyes had gleamed with hate that night. But here he was, talking like he'd found Jesus or something. I went home, tossed that crumpled coupon on the kitchen counter, and stared at it for a while. I had a court date coming up, and I don't know, something about that morning, him standing there with that hopeful, twitchy grin. I let it go, dropped the charges. I never did use that coupon.